And the picture here you see is Landgrave Frederick II of Hessen Castle reviewing his guard. So it dates slightly later from the period that I'm talking about. It's painted in around 1770, but it gives some indication of what I'm going to say. So I'm arguing that military power was inseparable from princely authority within the Holy Roman Empire during the 17th and the 18th centuries. The empire was one of the most heavily armed parts of Europe, and I'll give some statistics to show that, and was either directly or indirectly involved in pretty much every war on the continent. And the significance of this martial element to the history of the empire and to the history of the princes in particular has been largely obscured by the decentralized character of the empire and its largely defensive orientation. I'm going to talk about this in 5 aspects. The first of these the first two aspects are somewhat abstract, and then we move on to things which are a bit more cultural, I hope, anyway. Right. Okay, so first of all, I wanted to set this into the broader context. Despite the popular myth, the Peace of Westphalia didn't make the German princes independent sovereigns. Instead, it clarified their constitutional position within the Holy Roman Empire. It clarified their position as so-called imperial states, Reichsstände, along with the imperial cities. These collectively co-constituted the empire with the emperor. And it was this lack of full sovereignty that was one of the key things propelling the German princes to present a martial character and to become involved in military affairs. Growing French power and influence had made it obvious that Europe was changing character. It was being reordered from a single sort of hierarchical order into a multipolar order of several great powers and a number of medium and smaller ones. And it wasn't clear as to where the German princes would fit in with this. Were they the same as the French princes of the blood or a Spanish grandee? How did they fit into this broader new European order? And that was given added urgency by the internationalization of imperial politics during the 30 Years' War. So the princes' defensive status was no longer a matter of their immediate relations with their neighbors and within the empire. It was also, for them, a European question. And these pressures propelled them to seek internationally recognized titles. The best type of title to have was to be called a king. And between 1697 and 1715, 3 German princely families achieved this: the Saxons, the Prussians, and the Hanoverians. A number of others are linked, for example, dynastically to Sweden. And there are numerous also-rans, the Bavarian and Palatine Wittelsbachs, who failed to achieve this, notably during the War of Spanish Succession. My key point with my first of my reflections is, therefore, that elevation of status could only be achieved by the help of external sponsors, and the way to attract that sponsorship was by capitalizing on the military and political potential that the princes had. The second of my observations is to look at the constitutional position and framework that profoundly influenced the martial character of the German princes. Princes were legally mandated to maintain troops by the imperial constitution. This was part of the empire's collective system of peacekeeping and collective security. There was no restriction on the number of troops, and therefore no legal limit on army size. There were, of course, practical limits on that. Virtually all the principalities had, in fact, disbanded their forces at the end of the 30 Years' War. So there is, again, another historiographical myth that the 30 Years' War creates standing armies. That's not the case. They only maintained a very few garrison companies, most of them, and they added these in wartime. For example, the image you see here is at the Battle of St. Gotthard the victory over the Turks in 1664, where an army composed partly of princely contingents which had been mobilized under this collective system of security. However, the more powerful principalities had begun to maintain troops, including in peacetime, already from the 1660s, and this became much more common with the onset of almost perpetual warfare with the start of the Dutch War in 1672. So by 1714, these armies had definitely become permanent. The principalities that were maintaining armies already in the later 17th century became known as the armed princes, and the empire's mobilization structure was formally reformed in 1681 to 82 to curb the potentially disruptive impact of these armed princes. The law was restated that the unarmed princes were in fact allowed to raise troops to meet their obligations and didn't have to hire or pay one of their armed neighbours to do so. And that was, of course, a way in which the armed neighbours were trying to expand their authority and influence within the empire. So at this point, it's probably helpful to say, how many princes are we talking about? The empire is famously this monstrosity. It's so difficult to understand. How many princes are we talking about? Well, there were always far fewer ruling princes than there were so-called imperial states. If you look at a list of all the territories, you have those territories that are formally represented in the imperial diet. And there were 230 secular and ecclesiastical lordships, but there were only around about 160 separate princes and lords. And of these, only around 16 secular and 5 ecclesiastical principalities really mattered militarily. These were the ones that had become armed. The others were largely unarmed, at least in peacetime. So again, to put some more precision on this in terms of numbers, yes. Obviously, the largest armed forces in the empire were those of the Habsburg monarchy, and you can see there they are the ones that truly do have a permanent army already in the middle of the 17th century. They actually have one before the 30 Years' War, and it rises to a considerable total by the 1730s with fluctuations. Brandenburg Prussia indeed becomes the second largest, but its numbers again fluctuate, and it's only really after 1713 that it really pulls ahead of the other principalities. Perhaps more significantly and less well known are the 5 principalities that had substantial numbers. And to put these in perspective, each one of these, in other words, had roughly the same size as the British Army, as we've just been seeing. So Saxony, Bavaria, the Palatinate, Hanover, and the ecclesiastical principality, the Bishopric of Münster, briefly in the mid to late 17th century, was considerable. The others were generally smaller, 1,000 to 3,000 or so each. Right. Well, now we've established something about the international and the imperial context. Let's examine the roles that a prince could play. Right. So, more generally, we talk about the roles. Roles were influenced by dynastic status, an individual's position within a princely family. Some roles could be combined, but not all individuals could exercise each one unless their own personal circumstances changed. For example, that they became a ruling prince as opposed to just simply an heir or another family member. Only the most powerful princes could perform pretty much all of the roles. The man you can see there is Johann Georg III, the Elector of Saxony in the later 16th century, who is known as the Saxon Mars, because he is really the creator of the permanent army in Saxony during the early 1680s, and commanded this in person and was heavily involved in all the details of its organization. Family members were important in increasing the number of roles that each dynasty, each family could exercise. So the presence, for example, of junior branches could be important. Lesser princes and lords rarely exercised these roles on their own account. They would do so, exercising some of them in the armed forces of other princes or in serving foreign powers. And personal inclination, we have to remember, is important. We've got to remember these people were human beings. Not everyone wants to do everything, or everyone has the right kind of talents or interests. So the man you can see in the blue coat, Clemens August of Bavaria, a Bavarian prince, accumulated 5 ecclesiastical principalities, the most important of which was Cologne during the early 18th century. So he had considerable resources, but he had very little personal inclination. He appears in this portrait in a fairly martial pose. This is because this is a painting of him in his capacity as the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, but he actually paid very little attention to military affairs. And before you assume that I'm going to draw here a distinction between martial secular princes and peaceful ecclesiastical princes, the other man that you can see is Christoph Bernhard von Galen, who was one of Clemens August's predecessors as Bishop of Münster. Bishop of Münster from 1650 onwards. Expands the armed forces of Münster to a considerable extent, engages in aggressive wars. He's an ally of Louis XIV, for example. He was known as Bombenbernd or Bomber Bernard, the cannon bishop, for his own interest in artillery, which apparently he supposedly sighted the guns at the siege of the Groningen. And he is painted here. He might have an ecclesiastical garb, but he has pistols in his holsters. So the first of these major roles that a prince might be able to play is that of warlord. Regardless of inclination, all ruling princes held this by virtue of being a ruling prince. This was to exercise the so-called militaire Hoheit, or the supreme military authority in the principality within the confines of imperial law. This included determining the size and shape of the armed forces, provided, of course, there were sufficient funds, the appointment and promotion of officers, exercising judicial authority. You can see here the famous engraving from Fleming's military treatise. So it fell to the prince, for example, to confirm death sentences. They rarely, however, exercised actual command. This is because very few princes made war on their own account. Saxony, it's not actually Prussia, it's actually during this period largely Saxony that does this, notably during the Great Northern War, where they are an independent belligerent. More often, German princely forces fought either as imperial contingents or as auxiliaries for other powers, notably the Dutch and the British. And they would then delegate, they rarely commanded those troops in person, they would delegate that position to a general of their own choosing. General, of course, is another option that they could fill. And princes often held this rank, obviously in their own army, but also that of the empire or of a foreign power. And these titles, we have to say, are real. They're not the kind of honorific titles that were handed out in the 19th century to members of ruling families. Those holding them were expected to actually assume command when required. And that made, of course, it very difficult for a ruling prince to do so. The man you can see here on the screen is Ludwig Wilhelm of Baden-Baden, otherwise known as Türken Louis. He had become an imperial general before he became ruling prince. And he is unusual in that he continued to perform this role as an imperial general after his formal accession as ruling prince of the Margraviate of Baden-Baden. And that was possible because Baden was a relatively small principality. Anyone ruling a medium or larger principality would find it extremely difficult to be absent and to exercise this role. And there was, of course, all the other characteristics that we've heard about with the droit de guerre, the risk of death or capture, and so forth. So it was much more common for other members of a ruling family to act as general. It was also, the comments that I've made about the role of general also apply to colonel. Regiments were the primary building block of an army in this period. Being a colonel gave certain prerogatives, and it was also a source of wealth and patronage. Most princes were their own colonels. They were colonels of their own guard regiment or the leading unit, but they were also often, those who were not ruling princes were colonels of regiments in other armies, especially that of the emperor. The fact that you could delegate the actual command of a regiment to a lieutenant colonel made it possible in rare occasions for princesses to actually be colonels. The woman you can see here is Maria Augusta, the wife of Duke Karl Alexander of Württemberg, who was the official colonel of the dragoon regiment, and she retained that position when that regiment actually transferred into Prussian service after her husband's death. Involvement in raising an army and commanding an army also gave rise to the role of organizer. Not everyone, not every prince did this, but some did fulfill this function. The man you can see here is another relatively unusual example of a ruling prince who was a general in another army and continued as such when he became ruling prince. This was because the Principality of Anhalt-Dessau was again very small. This is Leopold of Anhalt-Dessau, who contributed to innovations in the Prussian army. For example, he's famous for introducing the iron ramrod and improving Prussian arms drill. And lastly, in terms of roles, that's of military enterpriser. So the organizer of contingents and auxiliaries that serve other powers. German military contracting differed from that in Switzerland and Italy. The Swiss and the Italians were much more likely to provide regiments that were integral to another power's army, such as the Swiss regiments that served in the French army, for example. German princes, by contrast, raised units that served temporarily, in most cases, and then returned. And they did this usually to curry favor. The man that you can see there is a soldier from the Saxon Weimar regiment that was raised at the beginning of the War of Spanish Succession by a consortium of Thuringian princes who were trying to secure favor from the emperor. Raising regiments was also a way in which you could advance the careers of your sons or of other family relations. And German princes in particular did this when they raised troops for the Venetians, securing pensions and titles for nominal colonels who were often at the time only children. Along with these roles comes an important element of self-fashioning. The exercise of military roles in this period, as I've stressed, was performative. You had to actually do this, and the individuals were judged on the extent to which they met expectations. And we need to consider the audiences for these performances. They included the immediate family, peers within the princes and lords of the empire, foreign powers, and also subjects, including military personnel. Princes had to look the part. Their physique, their general appearance, all of these things were important and they were commented upon. They needed to instill and to command respect, particularly when they were dealing with their own military officers, many of whom had far more experience and much longer service than they did. And yet these princes had to command authority. And we have to remember, I think, just how fragile princely and indeed royal authority often was. The martial presentation was conducted through physical presence, such as at parades, like the opening slide that I showed you, or in special military camps. What you can see here is the famous Lustlager, or sort of pleasure camp, it was called, at Zeitheim organized by the Saxons in 1730. This was a particularly lavish affair. There are other examples of these, and they've often been presented as not serious and so on, but they had a serious military dimension, and they have very much a very important representational dimension. It was also demonstrated through the collections of weaponry. The Saxons, for example, had begun to collect weaponry in a serious manner already in the late 15th century. And from the 1560s, the weapons were organized in the armory for display for invited guests. And obviously that, in fact, still exists as a public display. And there is a curious spatial shift to this. As the princes become armed, and as they develop professional armies, they actually defortify. So this is accompanied by the movement away from the kind of old traditional castles that they inhabited in the 16th and early 17th century and into the grand palaces, which are, of course, influenced heavily by the building that we're in. So there's a curious mixture. It's not accompanied, except in a few exceptions, with an extensive fortress building. The self-fashioning, of course, has the image then of the prince and how the prince looks in a martial way. Uniforms had become standardized during especially the second half of the 17th century, but at that period they only applied to the rank and file. Officers were increasingly required to wear uniforms from around 1700, but these were still styled differently from those of ordinary soldiers. And it's interesting that by about 1720, German officers are quite keen to have themselves painted as officers. So they are wearing their regimental uniforms. At that point, German princes are still painted rather in the portrait manner of the portraits I've shown you in antique armor. So the princes are sort of behind their officers in adopting this visual representation. The early pictures, for example, of Frederick the Great is shown in the classical style, just with a breastplate and a sort of aristocrat's coat. This changes around 1750, when they become princes, had themselves painted in regimental uniforms. And that trend, I think, does begin in Prussia. It begins with the father of Frederick the Great, Frederick William I, and it seems to have been influenced by the Swedish king, Charles XII. And it's Prussia's successes that lead to the adoption, I think, throughout the empire. What you can see here is slightly beyond the period, so from 1769, the man in the green coat is Emperor Joseph II. He is painted as a regimental colonel of a light cavalry regiment, whereas his younger brother is actually wearing a uniform that would technically outrank him. He's presented as he's wearing an Austrian general's uniform. So it's very interesting that the emperor, who is senior, adopts a regimental uniform. Okay, so my last area then is to consider the influences. I've already alluded to the importance of Prussia, but I think we can overrate Prussia as a role model in all of this. So let's get a little bit more precision on this. When we're talking about influences, this is influences on the organization, the administration, and the tactics of princely armies. It's also influences on the way that princes acted in their military roles, and especially its influences on the way in which they presented themselves as martial figures. Of course, France is an important influence, and there was a certain degree of emulation of Louis XIV. But of course, Louis XIV was a dangerous figure to admire openly. It was much easier to accept French influence through the Huguenots, and this was most pronounced in Prussia, which admitted around 20,000 of these between 1685 and 1700. At least 500 of these served as officers, and in 1688, at the start of the Huguenot emigration to Prussia, a third of Brandenburg Prussian officers were Huguenot. It led to the formation of a number of guard units, which were directly modeled on those in France. The Saxons also do this. They have French names, for example, but this influence is largely gone by 1710. Louis XIV, however, remained an important influence and a very significant role model for one man in particular. This is Frederick the Great. And here I'm drawing on the new work of Adam Storing, who shows very clearly that Frederick's idea of glory, it comes from his reading of Louis XIV, and especially the campaigns of Louis XIV's generals, and it makes an enormous influence on how Frederick acts, especially in the critical year of 1740. When we look at the other influences, well, we have the Habsburgs, who were really the primary role model until at least 1740, and Habsburg service was preferred. The majority of princes serving in foreign armies serve in the Habsburg army. There were, of course, the existing German traditions, hunting culture and so on is important for the naming of certain aristocratic orders that princes create and things like this. And there were the extended conflicts with the Ottomans. The adoption, for example, of Hussar units, which comes via the Habsburgs, and a number of German princes, their sons are painted, dressed as hussars and so on. This is a very fashionable thing in the late 17th, early 18th century. And Ottoman influences directly. Again, we see here Turcan Louis, this time dressed as a Turk. The huge quantity of booty that is taken in the relief of Vienna in 1683 creates an explosion of interest. Brandenburg and Saxony briefly had janissary bands dressed as Turkish soldiers. And again, this is an influence which I think is temporary and wanes, although it left a lasting impact actually on German military music and its choice of instruments. Lastly, within this, we have to remember that German troops had a broad, one could say, almost cosmopolitan service. They fight as members of coalitions. They served in Flanders, Ireland, Spain, Italy, Greece, Scandinavia, etc. So there is really no one dominant influence. The influences, the exchanges, the ideas, they come from a multitude of different places. So lastly, some conclusions. So I would argue that what we might term the era of Louis XIV saw the emergence of a defined martial culture amongst the German princes. This was framed by the imperial constitution, which lent legitimacy to the prince's possession of and employment of armed force within the empire and beyond. The greater permanence and size of armies after 1672 increased the number of roles available to princes. Some of these roles had been exercised before, warlord being an important one, but their character changed with the development of professional permanent armies. Princes generally enjoyed a privileged position within the hierarchically organized military. However, much depended on the perceptions of rank that included defined distinctions within princely families as well as amongst princely family members and beyond, as well as their own personal inclination, ability and opportunities. And lastly, though not all princes were militarily active, a martial image was an essential element of princely authority, especially in their presentation of themselves to their peers and to foreign powers. Thank you.